For years, Western media outlets have spread a blatantly fake story claiming that US spies and diplomats were being attacked with some kind of sophisticated sci-fi weapon, including radio wave weapons or directed energy weapons, like out of a sci-fi movie. And they blamed Russia, China, and or Cuba. Now, there was never a single shred of evidence of this, but it was called Havana Syndrome. And the majority of people supposedly affected by this fake illness, Havana Syndrome, were CIA agents, US State Department officials, and Pentagon officials. So this story was spread by every single major media outlet in the US and many in Europe as well. I'm going to document some of their lies in a second. But as you probably know, there's a catch here. It was completely fake. All of those stories were false. For months, we have had evidence from the mouth of the CIA itself acknowledging that there is absolutely no evidence that a foreign adversary like Russia, China, or Cuba was responsible for so-called attacks. In fact, the CIA acknowledged that there are perfectly reasonable medical explanations for so-called Havana Syndrome victims. And now we actually have video evidence directly from the mouth of the director of the CIA, William Burns, Mr. Burns. Now, I need to give credit to an excellent independent news website, friends of the show at Kaosachun News. This article was first published by them. They are the ones who came across this video, so I want to give credit to them. Kaosachun News published this on July 21st in an article titled CIA Director Admits There Is No Havana Syndrome. And this report is based on a video clip of CIA Director William J. Burns in an interview he did with NBC News at the Aspen Security Forum, which is, basically an arm of NATO. It is also basically a front for the military-industrial complex to push U.S. imperialist policies and advance the corporate interests of the Beltway bandits so these weapons corporations make more money. And it brings together a lot of top U.S. officials and other Western officials. Now, I'm going to play a video clip here of the remarks made by the CIA director. But before I do that, I just want to highlight some of the main points he made. He acknowledged, again, these are the words you should listen for. CIA Director William Burns acknowledged, quote, "We don't assess that a foreign player or the Russians or anyone else is behind or is responsible for a sustained global campaign on the scale of what has been reported to harm U.S. personnel with a weapon or some kind of external advice." He said that we investigated these cases as thoroughly as we possibly can, and they found that you could find reasonable alternative explanations, whether it was other environmental factors or pre-existing medical conditions or other kind of medical explanations. Now, again, I'm going to play this video clip in a second, but I want to point out another hilarious detail that you should keep in mind while you're listening to these words. This is the CIA director admitting there's no evidence that this is some kind of attack by a foreign adversary. But this NBC News correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, asks, but wait a second. The U.S. Congress authorized compensation for victims of supposed Havana Syndrome. How do you compensate it if you don't know what it is? And then William Burns says, well, it's not a question of causation. It's a question of what people have gone through. So he's saying, okay, well, we know that it wasn't caused by a foreign adversary, but people still suffered. By the way, keep this in mind when you're listening to the words here from the CIA director. This is a report in the Washington Post from June. U.S. to give some Havana Syndrome victims six-figure compensation. The Biden administration plans to pay some diplomats and intelligence officers roughly $100,000 to $200,000 each to compensate for the mysterious health problems known as Havana Syndrome. So while you're listening to this video clip here of the CIA director himself acknowledging that this is basically fake, there's no evidence this is a foreign attack. It's completely psychological. It's imaginary. So while you're listening to these comments, keep in mind that the U.S. government is going to be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars each to a bunch of CIA spies and State Department diplomats for this imaginary condition. Here is the clip from none other than CIA Director William Burns.
I want to ask you about something that has been going on for 6 years since the first known case, and that is what the government calls anomalous health incidents, and which is commonly known as the Havana Syndrome. So 6 years later, do we know anything more about what caused these illnesses?
On the investigation side, over the course of the last year and a half, we've thrown some of our very best officers at this, working closely with partners across the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. government. It's fair to say that we've learned a lot over that time. There's still more to learn. It's a frustrating process, but I have great confidence in the professionalism of the people who are carrying this out and in their commitment to objectivity. A few months ago, the intelligence community across the board, made public some preliminary findings. The broadest was that we don't assess that a foreign player, whether the Russians or anyone else, is behind or is responsible for a sustained global campaign on the scale of what has been reported to harm U.S. personnel with a weapon or some kind of external device. We further stated publicly several months ago that in the majority of incidents, and we've investigated each one as thoroughly as we possibly can, and we're still working on a number of them, that you could find reasonable alternative explanations, whether it was other environmental factors or pre-existing medical conditions or other kind of medical explanations.
So that is the very revealing clip there. Now, I have done a video / a podcast about this. It was one of the first podcasts I did when I founded Multipolarista in January 2022. You can find this at my YouTube channel or Rockfin or Rumble. It's called Doctor Explains CIA's Havana Syndrome Conspiracy is Mass Hysteria, Not Russian Ray Gun Attacks. This was an interview I did with the medical sociologist Robert Bartholomew. He wrote a book calling out how Havana Syndrome was obviously fake before the CIA admitted it. And you can watch that video, or if you like podcasts, you can listen to a podcast version. Before I conclude here, I want to go through and just summarize some of the media's fake stories, because it really is shocking to see the blatant lies that were spread by every single major Western corporate media outlet, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to Fox News to CNN to MSNBC, all of them. And I wrote about this at multipolarista.com back in January when the CIA acknowledged, it leaked this report that there was no evidence of foreign adversaries behind so-called Havana Syndrome. This article I published is titled CIA's Havana Syndrome Conspiracy Implodes. Here are media's worst fake news stories. You can find links to all of these articles and podcasts that I'm mentioning in the description below. So here you can see some of the, in this image here you can see some of the stories in mainstream media outlets. The Washington Post, CIA director warns Russian spies of consequences if they're behind Havana Syndrome incidents. Here's Time Magazine. U.S. diplomats in Cuba were injured by a sonic weapon. Fake news, false. Here's CNN. What we know about the possible sonic attacks in Cuba and now China. Politico. Russian spy unit suspected of directed energy attacks on U.S. personnel. CNN. U.S. investigating possible mysterious directed energy attack near White House. Obviously, all of those stories have been proven to be completely false. Now, this story continued to be spread for years. As recently as November of 2021, the Washington Post, a mouthpiece of the CIA, published this article here. CIA director warns Russian spies of consequences if they're behind Havana Syndrome incidents. So not only was the media strongly implying that Russia was responsible, but the CIA director himself, William Burns, back in November was saying there are consequences for Moscow. Well, fast forward just a few months, and now the same CIA director, Burns, is acknowledging, there's no evidence. We concluded that it's not a foreign adversary. So there are so many Western media articles like this. Back in December 2020, the New York Times published an article titled, "Report Points to Microwave Attack as Likely Source of Mystery Illnesses That Hit Diplomats and Spies." And the top U.S. newspaper of record, it quoted a report that was commissioned by the U.S. State Department, and it was conducted supposedly by the smartest scientists in the United States. And it claimed that Havana Syndrome was, quote, dizziness, fatigue, headaches, and loss of hearing, memory, and balance. They have been by U.S. diplomats who had been targeted by, quote, directed pulsed radio frequency energy weapons. I mean, there's no proof these weapons exist, so they had to fabricate them like a sci-fi movie. And again, this is fake news. It was proven to be fake. So here's a list of some of the media outlets that spread fake stories about Havana Syndrome. New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, CNN, BBC, Associated Press, MSNBC, Fox News, The Independent, Time, Politico, The Hill, and many, many more. Here I'm going to play a clip of this interview that I did with Dr. Robert Bartholomew, who's a medical sociologist. He is the expert who in 2020, he wrote a scholarly scientific book titled Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. He predicted this back in 2020. He was right. His book was proven right. Here is a clip of this interview that I did with Dr. Robert Bartholomew.
That first guy in Cuba who went to the embassy clinic, I think he probably had an earache and a headache, a common symptom all the time, right? Then it spread globally, right? Which was more mass suggestion. People getting up in the morning, having a headache, hearing a sound outside, and the next thing you know, because you've been primed by the State Department to be on the lookout for anomalous health incidents. You know, people have had anomalous health incidents since they lived in caves, right? And you've also got the Department of Defense doing the same thing. They issued an alert not long ago to all 2.9 million service personnel and contractors it's your patriotic duty to report anomalous health incidents. And what happens? You get now, like they're up to 1,000 now with anomalous health incidents being reported. There's going to be thousands more. Why? Number one, the symptoms are so vague. And number two, lawyers have now got involved and you could get compensation, right? I mean, here are the symptoms of Havana Syndrome: headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue. I mean, it's 9:30 here in New Zealand, and I probably had 2 of these symptoms already. Difficulty concentrating, disorientation, forgetfulness, confusion, tinnitus, insomnia, balance problems, head pressure, and ear pain. And then if you add it to the Canadian ones, they added things like nosebleeds, of which I think there were 2. And then, so that gets added on as well. And it's like, oh, nosebleeds, right? And it's so vague. Those symptoms are so vague as to be experienced by just about every human being who has ever lived on this planet on any given week or day of their lives. So for other cases of mass psychogenic illness, I mean, a good one is the Salem one, where, I mean, somebody would visit you and maybe you feel unwell, you have a headache, you feel stomach pain, and then you'd accuse them of witchcraft, right? It's so vague because once you get primed and you think it's witchcraft, or what's the difference between that and Havana Syndrome? The government has primed you for these symptoms.
So that actual scientific expert predicted back in 2020 that the story was false. That didn't stop years of blatant fake news stories in the corporate media. Here's Fox News. Russia suspected in Havana Syndrome attacks. Here's MSNBC. Senator Shaheen, Russia at the top of suspected list for directed energy attacks on Americans. Here is Time Magazine. U.S. diplomats in Cuba were injured by a sonic weapon. CNN, what we know about the possible sonic attacks in Cuba and now China. So not only did they blame Russia, they also blamed Cuba and China. They even at one point blamed Vietnam when Vice President Kamala Harris was going to Vietnam. Here's New York Times. Microwave weapons are prime suspect in ills of U.S. embassy workers. Here's Washington Post. Russia is an obvious suspect in Havana Syndrome, but they acknowledged the evidence is inconclusive. Here is NBC News. Havana Syndrome likely caused by pulsed microwave energy, government study finds. BBC. Havana Syndrome likely caused by directed microwaves, according to U.S. report. CNN. U.S. investigating possible mysterious directed energy attack near White House. So not only did they claim that it was happening in Russia, China, Cuba, maybe Vietnam, they even at one point in 2021, CNN claimed that it was happening in Washington, in the U.S. Capitol near the White House. Here's another follow-up article from 2021 written by U.S. spy agency unpaid intern Natasha Bertrand, who's basically just a propagandist for the U.S. spy agencies. Title: U.S. investigates second suspected case of mystery Havana Syndrome near White House. AP News: growing mystery of suspected energy attacks draws U.S. concern. Politico: Russian spy unit suspected of directed energy attacks on U.S. personnel. The Guardian: microwave weapons that could cause Havana Syndrome exist, experts say. False. The guy who wrote this, Julian Berger, is a propagandist who helped oversee the propaganda and the dirty war on Syria, spreading a bunch of ridiculous fake news stories about Syria. The Independent in Britain: what is Havana Syndrome? Inside the creepy directed energy attacks on U.S. diplomats. There's so many of these. Politico: U.S. investigators increasingly confident directed energy attacks behind Havana Syndrome. The face of Narco Rubio, neocon Marco Rubio, who has never seen a war he didn't love. Well, he was spreading fake news as well. Slate Magazine: are Russians using microwaves to attack Americans? No, fake news. The Sunday Times in Britain: U.S. diplomats hit by new Havana Syndrome attack. The Hill: CIA director says there will be consequences if Russia's behind Havana Syndrome attacks. And there's many, 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 many more. So, once again, when you see stories in the Western media try to blame Russia or China or Cuba for some kind of nefarious attack, they have no evidence. It's all attributed to anonymous U.S. officials using some kind of sophisticated weapon that we don't even really know if it actually exists. Well, you should be very skeptical. After years of this sustained propaganda campaign, we now know it was completely fake. And the CIA director himself has admitted that there's absolutely no evidence that foreign governments are behind so-called Havana Syndrome, and that there are perfectly reasonable medical explanations, as actual medical experts like Robert Bartholomew were saying for years. But of course, they were not given platforms on mainstream corporate media, because mainstream corporate media outlets are just propaganda vehicles for U.S. spy agencies and the military-industrial complex, as we can see so clearly in this case of Havana Syndrome. An actual conspiracy theory spread by all major respected media outlets.